You know, there is a specific kind of silence you only find in the mountains of Montana, a silence so profound it feels like a physical weight, like a heavy wool blanket that smells of pine needles and damp earth. And for the entire 18 months I was deployed in the sandbox, dodging IEDs, and trying to keep my squad alive in the stifling heat of the desert, that silence was the only thing keeping me sane. I would close my eyes in the barracks, ignoring the distant thud of mortars, and I would picture the Silver Creek homestead, 200 acres of rolling green foothills that my family had bled for since the late 1800s, land that my great-grandfather Elias had bought with the money he saved after surviving the trenches of France in the First World War. But when my boots finally hit American soil and I drove that rental truck up the winding dirt road leading to my sanctuary, I didn't find silence. I didn't find the peace I had been hallucinating about for nearly 2 years. I found the roar of diesel engines. I stood there, still wearing my fatigues, dropping my duffel bag into the dust as I watched a massive yellow bulldozer tear a jagged scar through the meadow where my horses were supposed to be grazing, the air thick with the acrid stench of exhaust, instead of the sweet smell of mountain sage. Standing there, holding a clipboard like she was inspecting a minor flaw in a wedding cake, was a woman I would soon come to know as the devil in designer heels, Linda Prescott. She was the self-appointed queen of Oakwood Heights, the soulless, cookie-cutter luxury subdivision that had been creeping toward my property line like a fungal infection for years. She looked up, saw me standing there with my jaw on the floor and a vein throbbing in my temple, and she didn't look scared. She didn't look apologetic. She just smirked, a cold, calculated stretching of lips that didn't reach her eyes, and walked over to me. "Welcome home, Sergeant," she said, her voice dripping with that sugary, toxic condescension that only professional manipulators can master. "We took the liberty of improving your little eyesore while you were off playing soldier." Playing soldier. I felt the blood rush to my ears, a roar louder than the machinery behind her, because she wasn't just insulting me. She was standing on land that was protected by a federal military land grant from 1945, land that I had left in the care of my 89-year-old neighbor, Old Man Harry, a Vietnam vet who was tougher than old leather and more loyal than a golden retriever. There was no way, absolutely no way in hell, that Harry would have let this happen unless he was dead. So I stormed past her, ignoring her shrill demands that I leave community property, and kicked open the door to my farmhouse, or at least, what was left of it. The place had been ransacked, stripped of furniture, but on the kitchen counter, buried under a pile of foreclosure notices from the Oakwood Heights Community Association, I found a stack of unopened mail addressed to Harry, and when I drove to his small cabin on the edge of the property, my heart broke. Harry wasn't dead, but he might as well have been. He was in a state-run nursing facility, confused, heavily medicated, and clutching a plastic cup of water with a trembling hand that used to be able to shoe a horse in 5 minutes flat. He told me, through tears of frustration, about the letters he couldn't read because his cataracts had gotten so bad, about the nice lady, Linda, who came to visit him and told him that I wasn't coming back, that I had been killed in action, and that the only way to save the ranch from being seized by the government was to sign it over to the HOA for safekeeping. She had lied to a confused old man, telling him I was dead so she could steal my legacy. I went to the county courthouse the next morning, fueled by a rage so cold it made my hands shake, and I found Clerk Martha Higgins, a woman who had been running the records department since before I was born and had a nose for bullshit that was legendary in Redwood County. Martha took one look at the paperwork Linda had filed and let out a low whistle, pulling up a digital file that showed a foreclosure auction that had happened exactly 3 weeks after my deployment orders were cut. "Honey," Martha whispered, looking over her reading glasses with fear in her eyes, "this isn't just a foreclosure. This is a hit job." She filed the lien for unpaid community improvement fees on a property that isn't even part of her HOA, and she did it the day you shipped out. She showed me the signature on the acceptance forms, a shaky scrawl that was supposed to be Harry's, but anyone who knew Harry knew he signed his name with a flourish, even with arthritis, and this looked like it had been traced by someone who had never held a pen before. Linda hadn't just stolen my land. She had committed forgery, elder abuse, and wire fraud. But when I confronted her about it later that day, finding her supervising the destruction of my grandfather's barn, she just laughed. "You really think anyone is going to believe a PTSD-riddled vet and a senile old man over a respected community developer? She asked, checking her manicure. I have the deed, I have the judgment, and I have the sheriff in my pocket. So why don't you take your little sob story and move on before I file a restraining order? That was the moment I realized this wasn't a civil dispute. This was war, and Linda Prescott had no idea. She had just declared it on a United States Army sergeant who specialized in logistics and demolition. I pulled out my phone and called attorney Maya Brooks, a ruthless shark of a lawyer who worked pro bono for veterans and hated HOAs more than she hated taxes. Maya listened to the details, her silence on the other end of the line growing heavier with every revelation, until I mentioned the federal land grant. If she touched federally protected military land, Maya said, her voice dropping an octave, she didn't just break state law, she committed treason against a military family during wartime, and that puts this in FBI territory. We started building the file, documenting every forged signature, every illegal survey marker, every lie she had told Harry. But Linda must have sensed the shift in the wind because the psychological warfare started 48 hours later. It began with anonymous noise complaints called into the police every time I ran my truck, then escalated to flyers posted around town claiming I was unstable and armed and dangerous, warning neighbors to keep their children away from the crazy soldier. But the breaking point, the moment that turned this from a legal battle into a blood feud, came on a Tuesday evening when I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo, grainy and poorly lit, showing a yellow excavator parked directly on top of the family cemetery plot on the North Ridge, the heavy metal tracks crushing the limestone headstone of my grandmother, Evelyn. The text read, "Progress requires sacrifice. Maybe now you'll understand that you don't belong here anymore." She had desecrated my grandmother's grave to send a message. I didn't scream, I didn't throw my phone. I just felt a calm, icy resolve settle over me, the kind of focus you get right before you breach a door, and I forwarded the image to Agent Rossi at the FBI field office, knowing that Linda Prescott had just signed her own death warrant. But as I was loading my gear, preparing to drive out there and stand in front of that bulldozer myself, my commanding officer, Colonel Jameson, called me from base, and his voice wasn't friendly. "Sergeant Vance," he barked, "you are to report to base confinement immediately. We have received credible intelligence that you have been selling classified troop movement data to foreign nationals, and the evidence was found on your laptop." My world stopped spinning. Linda wasn't just a greedy HOA president. She had reach, she had power, and somehow, she had just framed me for treason to stop me from taking back what was mine. The drive to the base felt like a funeral procession for my own life, the highway stretching out like a gray ribbon of doom as I tried to process how a suburban real estate developer could possibly orchestrate a military espionage charge. I sat in the interrogation room, the metal table cold under my palms, staring at Colonel Jameson, a man I had served with, a man I respected, as he slid a thick file across the table that contained digital forensics report allegedly proving I had leaked deployment schedules to a server in Eastern Europe. It was insane. It was impossible, but the timestamps matched perfectly with times I was online paying bills, and the IP address was traced back to my satellite internet connection at the ranch, the same ranch Linda Prescott had been squatting on for months. "I didn't do this, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the panic clawing at my throat. "You know me. You know I would die before I betrayed this uniform." "The evidence is overwhelming, Elena," Colonel Jameson said, his eyes hard, lacking their usual warmth. "And there's more. The JAG office looked into your land grant claims, the ones you say protect your ranch. They don't exist. The National Archives has no record of a Silver Creek grant from 1945. They say your family has been squatting on federal land for 3 generations. That was the gut punch that took the air out of the room. I knew those papers were real. I had seen them, held them, smelled the old parchment, but now I was being told that reality itself had been edited. Linda wasn't just winning, she was rewriting history. I was thrown into a holding cell, stripped of my rank and my dignity, pacing the 6x8 concrete box like a caged tiger, my mind racing to connect the dots. How could she delete federal records? How could she plant evidence on a secure military network? It required access, high-level clearance, the kind of access a civilian soccer mom shouldn't have in a million years. 2 days later, attorney Maya Brooks managed to get a visitation. and she looked like she hadn't slept in a week, her hair messy and her eyes wide with adrenaline. She leaned in close, checking the corners of the room for cameras, and whispered, "Martha Higgins, the clerk?" She found something in the metadata of the deleted archives. "What?" I asked, pressing my ear to the plexiglass. "The deletion commands didn't come from a civilian terminal," Maya said, her voice trembling. "They came from a DoD secure login, specifically a user account belonging to a high-ranking JAG officer who retired 2 years ago but kept his reserve status active." "Who?" I demanded. "Major Richard Prescott," she said. The name hit me like a sniper round. Prescott, Linda's ex-husband. The man she claimed to have a bitter, messy divorce with. The man she supposedly hadn't spoken to in 5 years. It was all a lie. They weren't divorced enemies. They were a criminal power couple. He was the inside man, the ghost in the machine who used his military clearance to hunt for deployed soldiers with valuable assets, erase their legal protections, and then feed the intel to Linda so she could swoop in and steal it legally. "He's the one who framed you," Maya continued, speaking faster now. "He planted the espionage data to discredit you because you were fighting back too hard. They usually target people who don't have family, people who just roll over, but you made noise, Elena, and now they have to destroy you to keep their operation hidden. We had the who, and we had the how, but we needed the proof." Maya told me that Agent Rossi was interested but needed hard evidence of the conspiracy before he could move against a field-grade officer. I needed to get out of that cell, and miraculously, Colonel Jameson, perhaps sensing that the evidence against me was too perfect, too clean, granted me a 48-hour temporary release under house arrest to prepare my defense, monitored by an ankle monitor. I didn't go home. I went to war. I met Agent Rossi and Maya in a safe house, a dingy motel on the outskirts of Redwood County, and we laid it all out. Rossi was a sharp guy, intense and tired of bureaucratic red tape, and when he saw the connection to Richard Prescott, his eyes lit up. "If we can prove he accessed the National Archives to delete your deed," Rossi said, "that's federal tampering. But if we can prove he used the DoD network to frame you, that's treason. That's life in Leavenworth." But Linda and Richard weren't done escalating. While we were strategizing, my phone buzzed with a call from Harry's nursing home. The nurse was hysterical. "He's gone, Elena." 2 men in suits came in with transfer papers signed by his legal guardian Linda Prescott, and they took him. They put him in a black van and drove off. They had kidnapped Harry. My blood ran cold. This was their leverage. They knew I wouldn't stop for my career, I wouldn't stop for my land. But they knew I would burn the world down for that old man. Then came the call. It was Richard Prescott himself, his voice smooth and arrogant, the voice of a man who believes he is untouchable. "Sergeant Vance," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "We have a mutual friend who is very confused and very fragile. He's resting comfortably at a private facility, but accidents happen when elderly patients get agitated. If you want Harry to see his next birthday, you will plead guilty to the espionage charges, sign the quitclaim deed for Silver Creek, and disappear." I looked at Agent Rossi, who was tracing the call, his fingers flying across a laptop keyboard. "You're threatening a federal witness, Richard," I said, keeping him on the line, my hand gripping the phone so hard the plastic creaked. "You know that's a mistake." "I'm not Richard," he laughed. "I'm a ghost. And you're a traitor. You have 1 hour." He hung up. Rossi looked up, his face grim. He used a scrambler, but he made a mistake. He stayed on long enough for the triangulation to ping a localized tower. "It's coming from the Blackwood Security Compound, a private military contractor site about 20 miles north. That's where they're holding him." "That's a fortress," Maya said, looking at the map. "We can't just walk in there." I stood up, checking the charge on my ankle monitor and grabbing my keys. "We don't have to walk in," I said, feeling the old combat rhythm settling into my bones. "I know that compound. My unit did joint training exercises there 5 years ago. I know the drainage protocols, and I know where the blind spots are." Colonel Jameson, who had been listening from the corner, finally stepped into the light. He had been skeptical, but the kidnapping of a veteran had crossed his line. "Sergeant," he said, "technically you are under arrest. But if you were to assist federal agents in a hostage recovery operation, I might be able to lose the paperwork regarding your location for a few hours." We rolled out under the cover of darkness. The Blackwood compound was heavily guarded, mercenaries with assault rifles patrolling the perimeter, illegal as hell on domestic soil, but Linda and Richard had deep pockets. Agent Rossi coordinated with a tactical FBI team, but I was the point man. I slipped through the perimeter fence, moving through the shadows like a ghost, the smell of ozone and wet grass filling my lungs. I found Harry in a detached specialized holding unit, looking terrified but unharmed. But as I was cutting his zip ties, the lights flooded the room. Richard Prescott stood in the doorway, wearing his dress blues, holding a suppressed pistol. Linda was behind him, clutching a tablet, looking less like a queen now and more like a cornered rat. "I told you to disappear," Richard sneered, raising the gun. "Now I have to make it look like a suicide. Tragic. Disgraced soldier kills neighbor, then herself." He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small concrete room, but the bullet didn't hit me. It slammed into the bulletproof tactical vest of Agent Rossi, who had breached the rear door a split second before Richard fired. Rossi returned fire, not to kill, but to neutralize, putting a round cleanly into Richard's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees screaming. "Federal agents! Drop the weapon!" The shout echoed as the room filled with armored bodies. Linda screamed, dropping the tablet and scrambling backward, trying to blend into the wall, but there was nowhere to go. I didn't look at Richard, writhing on the floor in his ruined uniform. I looked at Linda, stripped of her power, shivering in her expensive blazer. I walked over to her, stepped over her husband's bleeding form, and picked up the tablet she had dropped. On the screen was a live transfer of funds, millions of dollars moving from the Oakwood Heights accounts to an offshore shell company. "It's over, Linda," I said, my voice quiet, terrifyingly calm. "The renovations are canceled." The fallout was nuclear. The tribunal that followed wasn't just a legal hearing. It was a public execution of a corrupt empire. General Sterling presided over the court-martial of Richard Prescott, and the media coverage was relentless. The evidence Maya Brooks and Agent Rossi presented was irrefutable. We had the audio recordings of the threats, the digital footprint of the National Archives hack, and the testimony of Martha Higgins, who walked the jury through exactly how the Prescotts had targeted 17 different military families over a 5-year period. Richard tried to play the patriot, claiming he was investigating me, but when Rossi played the recording of him ordering this suicide of Harry, the room went silent. You could actually hear Richard's career disintegrating. He was stripped of all rank, dishonorably discharged, and sentenced to life in federal prison for treason, espionage, and attempted murder. Linda didn't fare much better in civilian court. Without her husband's protection, she turned on him instantly, trying to cut a deal, but the prosecutors weren't buying it. She got 25 years for racketeering, fraud, and kidnapping. 6 months later, I stood on the porch of the newly rebuilt Silver Creek homestead. The community had rallied around us in a way that restored my faith in humanity. Local contractors, veterans from 3 different states, and even some of the neighbors from Oakwood Heights who had realized they were being scammed too, all showed up to help rebuild the barn and restore the cemetery. Harry, looking healthier than he had in years, was sitting in a rocking chair, supervising the planting of a new oak tree near the gravesite. He pointed a gnarled finger at a group of volunteers. "You missed a spot," he yelled, grinning when they laughed. He was back where he belonged, safe, and protected by a new impenetrable legal trust Maya had set up. I walked out to the edge of the property, where the bulldozer tracks were finally fading under a layer of new spring grass. The air was silent again, that heavy, beautiful Montana silence, but this time it didn't feel lonely. It felt like victory. We turned the farmhouse into the Silver Creek Legacy Center, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting the property rights of deployed service members. We used the settlement money, millions seized from the Prescott's assets, to fund legal defenses for soldiers who can't fight for themselves while they're downrange. But as I watched the sun dip below the mountains, casting long shadows over the land my family bled for, I still wonder about the cost. Justice was served, yes. The bad guys are in cages. But I look at Harry's trembling hands, the result of the trauma he endured, and I look at the gray hairs I didn't have a year ago. It makes you ask the question, in a country that claims to love its heroes, why is the system designed so that we have to fight a war abroad and then come home and fight another one just to keep the keys to our own front door? Is justice real if you have to nearly die to get it? Or is it just a luxury for those who can afford the fight? What would you have done if you came home to find a stranger on your land? Would you have waited for the police? Or would you have handled it yourself? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.